A reading from Leviticus. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, 'You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall each revere your mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make cast images for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyards bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the aliens. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, and you shall not lie to one another. And you shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal, and you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." The word of the Lord. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a neighborly day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Please, won't you be my neighbor? The book of Leviticus is a book of the law that God gave to Moses for the Israelites. It begins with the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. It ends 27 chapters later, stating, "These are the commandments that the Lord gave to Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai." Chapter 19 of Leviticus deals with holiness. God called the Israelites to be holy. They could be holy, but they could only be holy because God is holy. Since God is holy, God's commandments revealed the way to holiness. God's commandments revealed how to treat God as holy and how to treat other people as holy. Treating God and other people as holy meant things like leaving produce in the fields for the poor and aliens to glean. It meant not stealing or dealing falsely or lying or swearing or cursing or treating others unjustly or slandering or hating or taking revenge or holding grudges. Being holy meant loving your neighbors and showing hospitality to strangers and acting with justice. And of course, loving God. The concepts of neighbor and conflict were mutually exclusive. The concept of neighbor necessarily required reconciliation for group stability. But who is your neighbor? In the early history of Israel, recorded in Leviticus, neighbor meant your people or your kin. For an Israelite then, every other Israelite in the early history of Israel was a neighbor. It was important to know who was in the group that you had to treat as a neighbor, because it was also important to know who was not in the group, who you should treat as an enemy. For the Israelites, all foreigners were enemies. That's probably not what God had in mind, since there are a number of commandments that apply to aliens and foreigners. So the question about identifying your neighbor became significant early on. Those Israelites who were most attentive to the law of God were always discussing how far the boundaries of neighbor extended. About the only thing that they all agreed on was that Samaritans were not and never could be part of the Israelite group. The Samaritans had started out as Israelites, but had perverted the worship of God, at least in the minds of the Israelites. 1,000 years later, in the days of Jesus' ministry, the question of neighbor identity and the practice of Samaritan hating persisted, providing context for this story from the Gospel of Luke. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, giving them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." There seems to have always been people that wanted to test Jesus, maybe to learn something, or maybe to expose Jesus as a fraud. One day a lawyer stood up in the crowd and asked Jesus about eternal life, and Jesus referred him back to the scriptures, which included Leviticus. Since the man was a lawyer and supposedly knew the law, Jesus asked the man what the law said. The man answered that there were 2 commandments that summed it all up nicely: love God and love your neighbor. Jesus confirmed his answer and said, "Do that." If you know the right answer to a religious question, don't just say it, do it. Feeling publicly duped, I think, the man then asked the unanswered question of the whole history of Israel: "Who is my neighbor?" So Jesus told a story My favorite story of all the stories Jesus told was a story about a man who, while traveling, was robbed and beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. Two Israelites passed him by, religious authorities actually, but they did not treat him as a neighbor. They just went on about their business. Then a Samaritan approached. I suppose from the beaten man's point of view, he really didn't care what the law said about neighbors. He would have been glad for anyone to treat him like a neighbor. When you're nearly dead and someone stops to take care of you, does anyone really care what religious or ethnic group the person is from? Even if it's someone you consider an enemy, as the Israelites considered the Samaritan. The Samaritan, not the pious religious people, not only cared for the man, but went above and beyond what the man could have hoped for, leaving him in an inn with an open ticket that the Samaritan would pay. Then Jesus turned everything upside down. For Jesus, the issue wasn't who your neighbor is, because behind that question always lurks the implied question of who your enemy is, because no one wants to have to care for their enemy. What Jesus asked instead was, which of the three men do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? I would guess at that moment the lawyer wished he wouldn't have asked Jesus who his neighbor was. The answer to Jesus' question was so obvious you didn't need a law degree to answer it. Still, the lawyer couldn't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. Instead, he replied, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus declared that he was right again. So, of course, he followed the affirmation up with the command to do it. Do what? Do likewise. Likewise what? Be a neighbor to whoever needs care. Show mercy. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a neighborly day for a neighbor. Could I be yours? Could I show you mercy? Please let me be your neighbor. Amen.